it's an environment where everyone feels like they have the courage to speak up and the confidence to know that they'll be heard. So when they do speak up, it will be well received, or at least heard and appreciated. Not necessarily agreed to, but at least heard and appreciated.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. I am your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be an interesting one. Our guest is a psychological safety expert who is the CEO of Noomi.com and Zarango.com. Stephan Wiedner, welcome to the show.
Michael, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, Stephan. And, you've got two companies that you're running, psychologically safety expert. These are some big things to cover here, and I really want to get into it. But before we do that, I'd love to hear your career journey that led you up to this point.
Yeah, sure. So I started my career straight out of university, and I worked for a construction management company. And our specialization, we were a small little group. We really focused on time management. So I'm sure many of your listeners are hyper-focused on cost management, and there's many other people within the industry that work on that. We focused on time management and in particular, critical path management, critical path scheduling. And so anyway, fast forward a few years, I got a bunch of years of experience, and because we were so small, they threw me on a bunch of relatively high profile projects, most of which were like conference centers or sports stadiums that we helped schedule. And at towards the end of my career, I was the head scheduler on a $100 million hospital. And so I found myself working with and being responsible for the project completing on time and coordinating with 50 or so sub-trades. So everything from rebar to windows, exterior closure, fireproofing, et cetera. All these different sub-trades. And I was responsible for making sure that the project ended on time. And it was a great responsibility. I was frequently in meetings with the head engineers and the head architect and the head builders. And most of these individuals had been in the business for 30, 40 years. And I had been there less than a decade. And I found myself feeling rather ambivalent about the work. Like I wasn't super excited about it. I didn't hate it, but I just felt like there was perhaps something else. And I was really looking for more innovative work. And I was also in particular really interested in human behavior and psychology and so on. And the construction industry is one that really hasn't changed much in 100 years or more. And so that's when I started exploring this whole idea of leadership coaching, leadership development. Started up the first company you mentioned, Noomi.com. It's a network of thousands of coaches all over the world. And through that platform, we deliver coaching services to organizations. And then more recently, we started up Zarango.com because we wanted to focus on delivering psychological safety-based work. It's very related to the coaching. It's not like a completely different business, but it was sufficiently different that when we weren't delivering it under a different brand, people were getting really confused. So I was talking to people about potential psychological safety work. Then they go to Noomi.com and go, this doesn't match up. What's going on here? So we started up a second brand, Zarango.com, and that brings me to where I am today, talking about psychological safety and all things regarding high potential teams.
I love it. I love the journey, and I'm curious now. We before the show talked a little bit about psychological safety, but maybe let's just I have some questions about that business. But first, let's open with what is psychological safety?
Yeah, I think based on the words psychological safety, likely people have some sort of assumption about what it is if you haven't heard about it before. And what it is there's a specific definition that we're using, which is it is the belief that within your work environment, you can speak up, you can say what's on your mind, you can even admit mistakes. You can say, oh, holy jeepers, I made a mistake here. And all of that without any fear of reprimand. So there's no concern that someone's going to perceive you as, the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, or that, that person with the stupid question kind of thing. So that's what psychological safety means. And for your listeners, maybe there's an easier definition that we like to use, the one that we use in our training, which is it's an environment where everyone feels like they have the courage to speak up and the confidence to know that they'll be heard. So when they do speak up, it will be well received, or at least heard and appreciated. Not necessarily agreed to, but at least heard and appreciated.
Very, very good. Well, that's very succinct and clear. What was it so you had Numi, and then what had that stand out that you were doing enough of that work that it would require its own brand? It must have been was it popular or much needed?
Well, it's a good question. We started exploring this concept of psychological safety primarily as a means of measuring the outcomes of the one-on-one coaching that we were delivering. So I wanted to make sure that as we are delivering coaching services, and let's face it, they're not always cheap, right? So if you're going to have one-on-one coaching for a CEO or someone at the executive level, you need a really qualified coach, and it costs a lot of money. And we wanted to make sure that when we were delivering those services, we can say, here's the outcome that was delivered. And by and large, every single coaching assignment that we were working on, that leader was trying to build psychological safety, even though that we didn't have a word to describe it at the time. And so when I first read about psychological safety, I thought, this is the thing we can use to measure the benefit of the coaching, because what we want to do is improve the leader's ability to communicate and thereby increase the psychological safety within their team. And we can measure that. That was the key factor, is this is something that can be measured. And so that was our initial foray into the concept of psychological safety. And how it evolved is that we started talking to more and more organizations about this concept. And quickly the conversation went from, well, I think we need coaching for this one or two leaders to, maybe we need to explore the concept of psychological safety more broadly within our entire organization. And so it expanded from this one-on-one engagement to a much bigger, broader engagement. And then that's when we realized, okay, I think we need to carve out a separate brand for the concept of psychological safety and all the coaching and consulting we're doing around that concept.
We'll get back to the interview right after this word from our sponsor. Wouldn't it be amazing if your bookkeeping business ran like a world-class franchise, like a Starbucks or an Apple store, one where the business literally runs itself? You and your staff would have documented training, systems, and processes to find the clients, price the clients, convert the clients, onboard the clients, service the clients, manage the clients, find the staff, qualify the staff, hire the staff, train the staff, manage the staff. Whew, wouldn't that be a lot easier? But then what if alongside that you had a community of other bookkeeping business owners that you could mastermind with, ask questions, support, and be supported along your journey? That would likely accelerate the success of your business, right? And what if you didn't have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to purchase the franchise, pay franchise fees, give up control and ownership of your business? Instead, just pay a simple monthly fee starting at $295 a month to access everything you need to scale your business. Systems for the sales, marketing, hiring, and technical bookkeeping, workflow and CRM software to manage it all, and a community to support you. That's Pure Bookkeeping. For over a decade, we've been helping thousands of bookkeepers grow their business by providing the systems and processes so you can run your business like a world-class business. Stop the trial and error game and start implementing the proven systems that will give you back your freedom, increase your income, and bring you peace of mind. Check out purebookkeeping.com for more information. That's purebookkeeping.com. Thank you for hearing from our sponsor. Now let's get back to the interview. Wonderful. And since doing that, what are some of the things that you've seen happening or transforming in the workplaces that you're working in?
Well, what we're seeing is that it takes time, first of all, for people to really embrace the idea of psychological safety. Often what we see is we measure it, and psychological safety is measured, say, 7 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. And then we come back a month later or 2 months later, and we're encouraging people to have open communication and open dialogue and challenge one another. And suddenly psychological safety seems to dip because now people are feeling empowered to speak up, and maybe they aren't quite skilled enough to do it in a way that's not offending others, or it turns into heated debate, which doesn't necessarily feel productive in that moment. So it's a bit of a journey for sure, helping organizations foster psychological safety. We also have this concept that we sometimes label psychological safety gone wild, where organizations will suddenly feel like everyone could speak up and say what's on their mind, and without any regard for others. And so we start to see the speak up side of it, but then the regard and respect kind of drop. And so it feels like a bit of a trade-off in that moment. And with time, it starts
like going from playing softball to hardball, fast pitch.
Exactly.
Hey, whoa, singer! What the heck?
Exactly. People feel emboldened to say, you know what, I think I deserve a 300% raise. Like, what? Wait a minute here, folks. We still, right. I get that you feel that way, but we need to have a more deliberate discussion about it, for example. And so there's maybe a bit of a pendulum that swings, and then we find that middle ground. Like, so it might start on the left and then it swings to the right, and now we find some middle ground. And when I say left and right, I'm not talking about political spectrum at all there. I'm just talking
for the ends of the spectrum. Yeah,
exactly.
Be very clear about that. Yeah. Perfect. Well, that's very interesting. And what I love about that is just, in the world of doing anything, it's like, how do we measure something to know whether it's being effective or not? And that, if you weren't able to measure it, which so many things, it's very challenging and difficult to measure, you'd never get through those dips. You'd be like, hey, this isn't working. And then you'd have to stop. Whereas now you can actually say, and this is what's going to happen in your business. It's going to improve a bit, go down. We're going to keep doing it. Then it's going to come back again. And the place eventually will be a better place to work.
Exactly. And I like that you end on that last phrase, a better place to work. That's a really important aspect of psychological safety and the reason to do it at all. Like, why spend the time and effort to foster psychological safety? What we know about it is that psychological safety is linked with high performance. So the best teams have a high degree of psychological safety, and the lowest teams, or the worst teams, or the weakest teams, tend to have low levels of psychological safety. And why is that? Like, if you scratch your head and wonder, why is psychological safety linked to high performance? And it's because that's how teams learn. It's all about the learning. And so if you're in an environment where you need to learn how to adapt to the changes, then you need to have psychological safety, much more so than if you're a perfectly oiled machine and you have no issues, right? But that's growing more and more rare. We are constantly facing all sorts of changes, whether they're external or internal, right? There's all kinds of external changes that we've faced in the last 3 years, unfortunately, with COVID. And there's all kinds of other economic issues, et cetera, et cetera. So anytime you're facing a great level of change, that's when you really need psychological safety, so that communication flows between people and there's a room and place for creating and evolving and developing new solutions to those new problems that are emerging.
It makes so much sense. I mean, and yes, so many challenges. I mean, it has me think like, oh my goodness, like does our culture, does our world even have psychological safety in this day and age? Like, what if I say something wrong, or I'm trying to help somebody or say something, if it's perceived incorrectly? Well, if people stop sharing, stop talking, the learning of our society, it's a ripple effect. It goes from the very micro right out to the macro of the society that we live in.
Well said, Michael. I couldn't have said that any better. I look at it, for example, between countries, right? Why is there not peace between countries? Ultimately, you could argue that it's because there hasn't been sufficient amount of psychological safety. And over time, without that, then there's all sorts of assumptions made about the other person, the other side, and ultimately peace degrades.
Mm-hmm. So true. So true. Now bring it back down to the level that we all do day in day business and our listener. What are some of the mistakes that business owners are making that lead to an unsafe, psychologically unsafe environment?
I would say the biggest one that we see, Michael, is one around a leader or business owner's mindset. And I think there's a general leadership style that we can call like the director, or, someone who feels like they need to be telling everyone what to do and how to do it. And that style of leadership doesn't necessarily open the door for feedback, doesn't open the door for discussion. And while I fully endorse the fact that, especially when it comes to accounting or bookkeeping, you need to get things right. So just because someone feels like putting an entry in a certain way into your accounting software doesn't mean they can do it. You need to have very tight and accurate processes. It's when there is room for discussion, that's when that kind of directive style will not necessarily lend itself to psychological safety, because people will be in the habit of saying, yes, I will do that, or no, I won't do that, but just basically following along. There's a lot of politeness and there's a lot of agreement. So that's what we would regard as a low psychological safety environment. It's not necessarily one where people are fighting, but it's one where there's a lot of politeness and agreement, and there isn't pushback, there isn't discussion, there isn't, hey, well, have you thought about doing this way, or how about doing it that way?
And everybody misses out. It's like the yes, being a yes person. Yes, that's a good idea. Yes, that's great. Do that. Versus that. Have you thought about that? That might not be a good idea.
Exactly.
Without that, how can anything evolve and shift and it gets back to that quality, to the high performance. If everything's a yes, it's like it might be garbage. And how would you know?
That's right. It's like following a leader off of a cliff, right? You don't want to do that just because they said jump, you jump. You want to be able to have that freedom to be able to push back and disagree and think about it. And I'd do it differently here if I could, kind of thing.
For sure. And right up to the leader too. If the leader's not creating that environment, they can't evolve, they can't get better and become ultimately what they aspire to be, because they're not getting the feedback that's accurate or true.
100%. Yeah. I would say the key there is vulnerability. So as a leader, you want to demonstrate vulnerability, or maybe humility. You want to say, look, I don't have all the answers all the time. I don't know how to do everything perfectly, but let's work on it together. I have confidence in us as a team that we'll be able to figure it out. That kind of a message opens the door to a lot of creativity and innovation. So you as the leader, you don't have to have all the answers. And I think that's the fallacy. We sometimes think, gosh, I've been lifted or raised into a higher leadership position, so now I need to have all the answers. But you don't have to have all the answers. Think of your role instead as a facilitator. You're facilitating the development of solutions within the team.
So true. And I remember when I first became a manager, when I worked in the corporate world, I became a manager, and that's exactly how I felt. I felt like I had to be perfect, and it was very stressful, and put a lot on my shoulders, and a good learning to go through and an evolution, but certainly would have liked to have that training prior to that. Taking on that role would have been a little more smooth. So you mentioned a really big one, which is one of the big mistakes, but I don't want to skip over others if there's others that you see happening where the owner themselves is not making this environment safe.
Mm. Well, when we start delivering our training to leaders or leadership groups, one of the fallacies that some of the leaders will embrace is that by having people speak up, we need to agree with them. That's not the case, right? Having people speak up and feel like they can be heard doesn't at all mean you have to agree with them. What you want to do is just make sure that you can demonstrate to folks that you understand what they're saying. And just feeling understood and appreciated is usually good enough. And it will also build better solutions. So if you have a perspective and someone else has a different perspective, if you can mutually understand one another, then you're striving for an even better solution. You're not necessarily striving for one where there's compromise, where one person has to kind of give in to give to the to cede to the other. You can explore a third option, which is how do we both get a win out of this?
I love that. I love that. And I think also really key is people bring up ideas. It's not whether those ideas are good or not. There's celebrating the fact that someone's brought an idea and acknowledging the act of giving an idea or bringing up an idea versus the idea itself, and separating those two perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's a great story. I was just listening to a podcast. I'm Canadian, so I live up in near Vancouver, Canada. And as such, I'm a hockey fan. And so that's one of my indulgences is I'll listen to a couple different podcasts all about hockey. And one of them, they're telling the story. He's a manager in the pro leagues and was once a player. And so he was describing this year that they had won the championship. And at the beginning of the year, their team was doing really poorly. And so they had this meeting. It was just like all hands on deck, everyone. And what he said is, well, we can't win with this coach. That was what he said. He said, we can't do it. And this coach was really successful and had a great career up until that point in time. And in the end, what happened is they didn't fire that coach because someone else in that meeting, everyone spoke. And then someone right at the end said, yeah, I'm hearing all of you. We're going to do X. We're going to do Y. We really need to focus on this and that. And then he pointed directly to the person that was on this podcast. And he said, and no, we're not going to get rid of the coach. We're going to do this with the coach kind of thing. And so he was fully disagreed with, but just to be able to say that, I think was a really moving experience for everybody in the room, because some people were probably thinking it. They just wanted to air their frustration with how they were working with the coach. And that opened up the room to say, here's how we would like the coaching to be different. You see what I mean? He said, let's fire the coach. They didn't fire the coach, but it was really freeing for him to be able to say it and not be fully judged and told to shut up. And, that there was room for that to be heard. And that's a big difference.
I get that. And it's this level of trust, like even for that player, that it's like, no, we're not going to fire the coach. I mean, it's trusting that those people that have said that have the best interests of everybody involved at the best it possibly could be. And that's where, being told no or having a disagreement with an idea, if you trust that other person, then it's like, okay, well, I've said my piece and I'm willing to work together to go wherever we need to go. But you could see how if that person didn't trust them, it might become, well, dig my heels in here, going to try and tell others to build a case against you. You could really see how it could go without sort of working on all aspects of it. You really could continue to shut down the group, if you will.
Yeah, I like that. Good reframing, right? And I think we make a couple distinctions between the content of the conversation and then the process by which we're communicating. And think about it. I suspect a lot of your listeners have probably heard the phrase, are you working in your business or on your business, right? Like, are you working in it just in the day-to-day details, or are you able to step back and think about, well, okay, what's your strategy? How are we going to move forward here? And it's the same thing when it comes to teams and communication. Are you just immersed in the details of the conversation, or are you able to step back a little bit and look at how are we communicating and giving someone the platform to say, I think we should fire the coach. You don't want to get hooked into the content there, but you want to get hooked into the process and say, okay, that was great. I appreciate you saying that. Let's unpack that. What do you actually want to say regarding the coach?
That's right. That's right. And I think getting back to what you said earlier about, you do this work, it has actually a dip. And that's where the dip, you come out of the dip, is that people feel heard. You make changes based on what needs to happen. And eventually you increase trust and everyone feels safer. And it's just like now that starts to create momentum. And that's perhaps what builds that winning team.
Yeah. And I think that's the end of that story, is that they ultimately felt like, okay, we all have each other's backs here. We trust each other implicitly. And now we can just go out there and do our best work, knowing that we all have each other's backs. There's no more finger pointing. We've been able to air all of our dirty laundry. We've said what we need to say. Now we can focus on just doing the work.
No, lovely. Absolutely lovely. Great story. Tell us a little bit about failing like a pro. You've written about this somewhere. What is that?
Well, failing is how you learn. So what we try to advocate is for people to really try to fail and embrace failure, and rather than stigmatize it, think about how to reframe it into a positive. And this is particularly important for teams, right? So what we know with psychological safety is that there's an aspect of psychological safety which is all around your tolerance for risk and failure. And when people feel like they can't take risk on a team, that's going to impact how innovative you can be. And we know that those who are really successful are able to take risks, and calculated risks. That doesn't mean you have to bet the whole farm. There's a strategist out of Harvard, and his name is Dr. Yoffe, and he talks about making bets as an organization. So when you run a company, you want to place bets, but you don't want to place bets that can sink the entire ship. So you want to be thinking about that and creating an environment where you can have your people take risks, try new things. And it's all about how you frame the failure. I'll give a good example with Google. Google has what they call moonshots. So once upon a time, they embarked on this idea of having engineers focus on some sort of crazy, bright-eyed, wild idea that might affect the business 10 or 20 years down the road, kind of thing. And they called those moonshots. And what they recognized is that 99% of moonshots go nowhere. Mm-hmm. So you end up spending 1, 2, maybe 3 years of your life as an ambitious, smart, dedicated engineer on some sort of project that just gets shelved, and with 99% certainty that it's likely to be shelved. That might be a massive stigma on your career, right? To say, yeah, look at my resume. I spent 2 years working on this project that got nowhere. So they had to reframe how people and engineers perceived the failure of a moonshot. And so they created a whole ritual around that and celebrating it and really giving people an award for the work and the time and the effort that went into it. And so that's what I would advocate, is look around your work environment and say, okay, how do we perceive failure around here? And what kind of failure do you want to embrace so that you can get better and improve? And then work to destigmatize that failure.
I love it. That comes back to kind of a question I had earlier on, which when you were talking about the training that you do, when you start to do this, like, what are some of the exercises that our listener could do to start to increase this trust and belief that people, could speak up, and also reduce that risk of perceived risk, I guess, of failure?
Yeah. The first thing I would do, action I would recommend that people start taking is just start noticing. Like, you don't have to do anything. Just start noticing within your work environment what might cause someone to just not say something? And most of the time, it's not because they're being malicious or trying to withhold information. It's just that it doesn't occur to them, or they don't feel like, this needs to be shared, or that it needs to be said in the moment. So just start there. Start by noticing, and notice for yourself what might cause you to not speak up. Like, for example, as a business owner, let's say you run into a bit of a cash crunch. How might you present that to your team? What might you say? It's clearly causing you stress. It's probably noticeable to some of the people in your organization. How might you bring that forth? And what's causing you to withhold that information? And go to work exploring that. And then if you start noticing other people being tentative and not quite as forthcoming as you would like, then you can pull them aside and just say, hey, I noticed in our meeting today, we were talking about that customer that we're dealing with, and it seemed like you were just saying it's all fine, but I'm detecting maybe there's something more there. So is there something more I need to know about? And doing so in a non-judgmental way. Is that helpful, Michael? Does that make sense?
It is. And I love the fact that there's nothing for them to do other than paying attention and looking around and being observant. And that's that coming back to in it, or on, are you working in the business or working on the business, is that when you're in the business, you're working away, not paying attention, lift up your head. What's really going on here? How are people communicating? And such a refreshing way to do it. Sit back, have some tea, look around, and think about that if you have a team, or how you interact with your clients, perhaps. Those are all good telltale signs of how you perceive risk. And do you feel comfortable speaking up to your clients, to your staff members? Great thoughts.
Yeah. I like that you're mentioning also the relationship you might have with clients, right? How do you maintain psychological safety in those environments, especially with something like bookkeeping? That seems paramount, that you need to have an open discussion between your client, because this is core of their business, right? They need to know what's happening with the numbers and make sure that there's really good and tight processes. And so if you're starting to notice things that might be a little bit askew, you want to make sure that you have the ability and you feel safe to be able to say to your client, gosh, I'm noticing some funny things going on here. Help me understand what's going on, so that they can be better informed on what's happening. And maybe there's something going on in the business that they just haven't told you about, and yet it's totally relevant to your work. You need to know about that stuff.
Absolutely. And I would say there's likely a correlation between dissatisfaction of the work for our listeners, the bookkeepers that are doing this work and working with clients, and their own perceived safety around being able to speak up, right? Because we constantly hear about pushing back, right? Like, being taken advantage of, being overwhelmed by clients, pushing the scope of projects. It's like, okay, we've got a job here. This is how much it's going to cost. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, but can you break some bread for me? Can you pick up my laundry? Being able to feel safe to communicate. It's like, no, that's not what we're doing. That's a big one for many of our listeners. And so I think it falls in with this, is to notice, is it the fact that you're have fear speaking up, perhaps, that's causing that dissatisfaction or almost angst around having to deal with some clients? If you can improve in that area, your own satisfaction and experience of your work will improve, I would imagine. And as well, you probably get a whole bunch of other benefits, like charging more and, making sure that clients are doing better in their business by giving them better advice.
Yeah, I think one way to do that, Michael, is to be more bold in your communication with clients. So, for example, I could see how between a bookkeeper and a client is that there's this tension where you, as the bookkeeper, you want to know that everything's going just fine, that they're getting good value and that they're getting a good experience. And so when you ask for feedback, you want to hear good things, right? You don't want to hear the bad things. And also, depending on the other individual, they might be inclined to want to tell you, yeah, it's fine, it's fine. But if they're not happy with the service, or if things, you could be facilitating better outcomes for them, they might not necessarily tell you. And so one strategy you might want to use is what we sometimes call the black hat. So it's, rather than saying, what's going well, you might want to say, okay, we clearly have been working together for 6 months or a year or whatever. I want you to tell me one reason why you would fire me, or what's the worst thing that we've ever done, or you see what I mean? Like, you want to empower that other person on the other side to start thinking about a little bit, providing more critical feedback that ultimately will be more actionable for you. And so if you can be bold and say, you know what, give me one reason why you should fire us. That takes some courage to be able to say that, right? That's bold.
Some courage there, yes.
But then it's saying, look, I care so deeply about providing you with the best value that I am willing to ask that question in the first place. And so suddenly, even if they don't come up with an answer in that moment, they might be thinking about it future down the road. And then you can say, okay, you can come back to it next week or next month and say, remember I asked you that question? I'm serious. I want to hear an answer. Like, what, if we could revolutionize our working relationship, what might we be doing differently? How might we be interacting with you differently to give you better results?
I love it. And what a pathway to a better communication relationship by having someone air all of the dirty laundry that might be there. And once they're fully heard, it goes away, and they new things, there's something new is going to be put into that place, which is likely a lot more positive.
Yeah,
for sure. And there was one way of asking that I did on a recent episode. It wasn't related to this, but I think it would apply, which is love it or leave it. What are the things you love about us, and what would you leave? A great way to frame a question like that in a real emotional way, I guess. Maybe a fun way is the way I'm trying to say it.
Yeah.
Very cool. Stephan, please tell us a little bit more about, there's a lot here that I think is very relevant to our listener, to their clients as well, because you can imagine our listener has a window into many, 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 many businesses out there, which I'm sure they see communication challenges all over the place. If they wanted to learn more about this or find resources that they could either help themselves or direct their clients to, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. The first thing I would invite folks to do is measure psychological safety. So if you're curious about this topic, you're curious about it for your own organization, or if you have clients that are curious about it, the very first step I would say is, let's measure psychological safety. Let's get a baseline measure and have that form the basis for an open discussion around how we might improve psychological safety. And so I'm offering to all of your listeners the ability to get their team's psychological safety assessment measured. And I'd be happy to offer that to all of your listeners. In order for them to take advantage of that offer, just go to our website, zarango.com/free PSI. So PSI stands for Psychological Safety Index. So I'd love to do that for you and your team. And if you have any clients, send them to the same URL. So it's zarango.com/free PSI. And it would be my honor to work with you and any other clients that you might have in doing that very first step of measuring psychological safety.
It's wonderful. It's absolutely a great next step for our listener, and think I might take it up myself. It sounds like a real opportunity to benchmark and start learning more about this wonderful topic.
And if I could add, Michael, measuring psychological safety is simple and quick. It's 7 questions. So it's not like one of these onerous things that's going to take a half an hour for each of your team members. It takes 3 minutes. And yet the results are really meaningful. And so there's really no reason to not want to embark on this journey of exploring psychological safety within your organization. It's fairly quick and painless.
I love it. I love it. Very good. And Stephan, this has been absolutely a fantastic conversation. On behalf of our listeners, I want to thank you for your generosity and coming on the show and sharing what you know about this. I really see this making a big impact for our listeners. So thank you.
It was a pleasure, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity.
The pleasure is all ours. And with that, we wrap another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. To learn more about today's wonderful guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.